All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Uncoder after a couple weeks break, I think. Today, we're not going to be talking about hair. That's why our lovely producers try to give you a little more context for why there's pictures of hair behind me right now. We're going to talk about extensions, particularly how you extend Unqork. And when I Googled extensions to get a good background, I got all hair extensions. So here we are. Extensions it is. So you maybe this sounds exciting. Maybe you're a little confused. Like extending Unqork, what does that mean, right? And what you're going to actually see is code. We're codeless, right? What the heck is the Uncoder doing talking about code when he's supposed to be talking about codeless? And you may also question, well, if there's code to extend it, how can it be a codeless platform? Right? Existential questions come up when we discuss the ability to extend Unqork. But the need to do it is great, right? Unqork has tons and tons and tons of features, a lot of which we've shown you, and many of which we probably haven't even gotten around to showing you on this Twitch channel. But it's not going to be every feature you ever want. That's a common thing that people always talk about with no-code, low-code platforms is it's great for the things that it does, and then the moment you need to do something, it doesn't, you're stuck. And why did you ever use this platform? Unqork, the number of those situations you ever face with Unqork is low to begin with, right? There's a wide suite of features that just give you what you need out of the box, or at the very least, give you the pieces, the components, tools that you need to achieve effectively everything, right? We've shown you dynamically rendering UIs in Slack. We've showed you connecting to AWS. We've showed talking to every API under the sun and doing crazy analytics against that data. We've shown dynamically rendering sections of the page. We showed building AI in video games, right? Like, I think it's pretty clear. And all this was with no code, right? It was codeless. So you could do a ton, right? So the need to extend it is a lot less about my ability to do it as it is the ability to do it that maybe the way a certain person wants. Like customers, our customers and a lot of organizations are investing in, building reusable UIs, web components, design system elements, things like that, things that help their developers build faster or in whatever technology they choose, and also have all of their teams do things the same way, right? Like if I go to one application that my organization has built to do something and there's a certain user experience, it would be nice if the next application I went to had the same user experience, the same patterns, the same UX, right? It makes your end user's life better. So if you've invested in building things for one application and now you're using an Unqork or something, how do you ensure that those experiences are seamless? And a lot of times customers want to bring their own experiences to the table. There's examples where Unqork again doesn't do the exact thing you want. Here's a great example for this is directly connecting to a database, right? Unqork is API driven. If you want to talk to a database that lives somewhere else, make an API, right? It makes sense from an architectural perspective. It makes sense from a security perspective. I mean, you don't want to be having other applications directly connecting to your data and do things that maybe the owners of that data don't want, right? The moment you directly connect, I can write any query I want. I can do whatever I want with the data. Building that API in front of your database helps you to really vet the access and control what people can do. But some customers still say, hey, I want to connect to a database, right? Well, Unqork will never do that. I don't want to say never, but like we have really good reasons why we don't do that. So you need to write code, an API or something to do it. It's not a bad thing, right? It actually that code, that extending what Unqork can do, like talk to a database via some code in an API effectively, is extending Unqork with code to handle things that it doesn't natively do for better or for worse. So then that's what folks want, right? Folks want to be able to do that for a number of different things. And Unqork wants customers to be able to do that. There are a number of times when people will ask us for things and we just go build the best version of it for you. And then every user of Unqork gets it and it's great. But, maybe you just want to do it yourself. So it's something that people want to extend, but going back to the existential nature of it, how do you extend a codeless platform with code and still have a codeless platform? Right? That's the key to extensibility, in my mind, at least in Unqork, and how we expose the abilities to extend going forward. So what that boils down to, in my humble opinion, is that JSON definition, that codeless definition that we've shown, that we've talked about, that we view as like that is your declarative representation of everything, right? We've covered that so many times. That needs to stay codeless, right? The moment we put code into your codeless definition, now we've broken the benefits and the promise that codeless architecture and codeless as a service brings you, right? But as long as that declaration is declarative, right? As long as that JSON is purely just declarative and doesn't contain any implementation code, then your code lives somewhere else and does what it needs to do. And that's how Unqork works today already, right? Like obviously there's code in Unqork. Unqork would not exist without code. But you're not the ones writing the code, right? The user who's inside of Unqork, dragging and dropping components and configuring their settings, they're not the ones coding. Today, it's Unqork that's doing all the coding, right? To keep that experience codeless. Tomorrow, our customers, developers in the world, whomever, can start writing code to add capabilities to the platform, but keeping that definition codeless, keeping it declarative, right? So just like our text field, when you drag it in, we have code that handles what the text field is supposed to do. Tomorrow, you can bring your own component. You will drag and drop it in. You'll configure it in settings. And then there's code that knows what it needs to do with the codeless definition of that new component that maybe you want to bring. So this is something that we're in the early phases of really ironing out and building into, the right strategy and the right product vision for it as a whole. But we have things that we can do today for it. So what I want to show today are some examples of how you could already, in theory, extend Unqork with code while keeping it a codeless platform for the end users who are building the applications for their users. Okay, so with that said, let's pull it up and let's talk through two of the extension types that we're going to cover. And those two extension types are extending the front end and extending the back end. Right, so extending the front end, I'm in the UI, I want some new capabilities available to me in the UI, or I want to bring in, again, some component that I've built, even a web component, as you see in the second item on this list here, web components. We'll talk about how you can actually bring web components in. And then on the other side of it's the back end, right? How do I make the server side, where I'm doing all my API logic and a lot of my complex business logic, how do I extend that effectively, aka how do I easily build APIs, right? Which is really what it is. How do I build APIs to maybe do that and start to bring those in, potentially without having to go build an entire API framework and then, have to worry about deploying that, because when you do that, when you say, all right, I extend Unqork via API, well, now you have to own that API and you have to manage that API. There are other things and capabilities, and you can probably look at my browser tabs and see the second tab and know where I'm going with this. But there are other capabilities that are being used throughout all software development, which could simplify the ownership and the maintenance and the responsibilities of users who want to extend, the back end with code, but not have to introduce more technical debt and more administrative and operational responsibilities onto their teams. Okay, so we'll go through some of these examples, and I'm going to show what it looks like in Express and in the Unqork side of things, which again will be codeless, and then I'll show some of the code that lives there for it. Now, for folks who have a direct line to someone at Unqork, or maybe you're interested in this, I will say that it's a proof of concept. It works. Is it production grade? You can make that determination yourself. I personally am happy sharing this with everybody. But, make sure you're talking to the right people if you decide to use this, either flavor of extensibility, before you really bake it into a production application, because these really are just kind of exploring the art of the possible more than anything else. But there's a level of it that I do think, can exist in current development. All right, now it's time to actually go through the things we're talking about. So let's just show some examples of what do I mean by an extension. Okay, well, what does an Express extension potentially be? So the first thing I'm going to show is the query string. Okay, for folks who may be unfamiliar with a query string is the stuff that appears in your URL after the question mark. So if you go do a Google search, you're going to see Google with Q equals whatever I search for, right? That's my search term, right? So that's the query string. Now, some of you may be looking at this or more familiar with Unqork and say, hey, wait, Unqork already supports the query string. I can already take things from the query string, and I can, access them via configuration. You're right. But if you ever tried to write back into the query string, different story, right? I can't, through my configuration today, add a query string, a value into my query string. Why would I ever want to do that, right? Like, when would that even be a valid thing to do? An example of that could be dashboarding and filtering, right? And searching, just like Google. Google puts Q equals whatever you searched for in the URL. Why? So that you can copy paste that link, send it to your friends, and they can see the exact same Google results that you see. Same thing if you're building a dashboard in Unqork where you're viewing a number of submissions. Like, a great example of that, and I'll show you this. I'll show you what Unqork looks like. So here it is, right? Here's the query string. So I clicked a Chrome extension. I don't know if you saw that based on the way I'm sharing, but I'm accessing the service logs dashboard. And in the browser, in the URL, you can see there's a query string. But that's what I linked to, right? And these are the links you want to be able to share. You want to be able to share a query which controls the filters on the left side, right? I said over here that the module name filter, the module ID filter is this. So of course you could see the application, the service logs dashboard was able to pre-populate filter criteria based on the query string. However, let's just start at the base dashboard. I just come into the dashboard for the first time. Okay, I'm looking at everything now because I haven't applied any filters onto my dashboard. But now I want to go in and I want to say, okay, well, only show me the results that were between today at midnight, basically, until today at 3 a.m. Okay, so if I build this filter out and I hit apply filters, okay, I was sleeping at this time, so nothing was happening, thankfully. But here's my filter, right? Now, if I want to send this to somebody and say, hey, somebody, look at these logs, I go into my URL and I go to copy the link, but the link doesn't have the filter in it, right? So if I send this link to somebody, what's it going to do? It's just going to open a blank dashboard again, or the default dashboard with no filter set. So what you might have noticed the service logs dashboard has is it has a button here that's called share filters. When I click share filters, it gives me the URL with the filters in the query string, right? Because that was the only way that we were able to make a shareable link, was to just tell you what it was and then you copy paste it, right? But wouldn't it be cool, maybe, where every time I hit the apply filters button, the query string updates to include the filters that I applied, right? That's what you can get out of writing to the query string. Okay, so let's look at some config that allows you to do it. So here's some configuration, right? I'm going to ask it for a key and a value, and I'm going to say whether I want to add or remove that from the query string. That's going to run a data workflow operation, which is going to basically build an object that describes the query string. Key value, key value, key value, key value. Because that's all the query string is, right? If I look at this query string over here, or sorry, the one that I shared, like what this really looks like in an object form, it's start date, colon, 2023, right? Start hour, colon, start minute. It's an object, okay? Which then you convert into a string. So that's what it's doing. It's building out that object, okay? And then conversely, the remove does the opposite. It actually goes in and it filters out that attribute from the query object and then sets the new one, okay? Just config, no code in here, okay? If I preview this now, go into my Express side, and let's try it. Let's just say key equals value, and I add it. And now look at that. My query string has key value. So my configuration, where there's no code, just now wrote to the query string. Okay, and I come down here and I just hit remove and it goes away. I can hit add and it comes back in, so on and so on and so on, right? So now I can actually manipulate the query string in real time in my configuration so that my URL, I can just grab, copy, paste, boom, good to go. Okay, so that's not a feature of Unqork, but it's working codelessly. It's still codeless. How did this happen? Okay, so this happened in a POC version of what will come later in Unqork, which is an SDK, effectively, software development kit, SDK, to add features into Unqork. So what's happening here? How is this how am I getting code into this page And how is this code knowing what's going on in my config to do something that config can't currently do, like write a query string value? Okay. So the first thing I'm going to show is how I'm getting the code in there, right? Now, some people, some people, what they will do is they'll drop a content component in. You probably all have known about a content component. I can drop it in, and we don't ever want anyone to ever do it, but I could write some JavaScript inside of a script tag, and I'm good to go. Why is this bad? Again, now your code is in your codeless. That's what we don't want. We don't want implementation mixed with definition effectively. So this is a bad way to do it. It's a bad way to do it because now code is inside your codeless. That's bad. It's a bad way to do this because this code doesn't execute when code's supposed to execute, so to speak, right? Because think about the order of events in the browser when Unqork works, right? The first thing that happens is we load up all of our JavaScript. Okay. Then we say, oh, look, the user wants to get this module. So then we make an API call to the server. We get back that codeless definition of this module, and then we render it on the page. So that JavaScript that I wrote in the query in the content component over here doesn't actually exist until Unqork has loaded. It's made the call to get back the codeless definition of the module, and then it's rendered everything that it needs to render to make that codeless module appear on the screen, and then the code runs, right? So it's not when and where you want your code to be executed. It's not the best, performance from just leveraging browser performance the best that you can, nor is it the best user experience. Okay, so we don't want to do that for so many reasons. So instead, what we've done is we've come into our environment administration and we've used these Google Tag Manager settings. And we added in a Google Tag Manager container ID. Okay, so what is Google Tag Manager and why can I add a Google Tag container ID into Unqork? So Google Tag Manager is, as it says, it's a way for you to manage all these different tags that you want to add to your page. Okay, so thinking about this from a typical use case of Google Tag Manager, I'm running a website and I want to add Google Analytics. Okay, I can go into Google Analytics. I can grab the snippet code for Google Analytics. I can paste it into my head tag of my HTML, and now I've added Google Analytics. Well, then somebody else comes along and they say, "Oh, can you add Adobe Analytics?" Also, "Oh, can you add, insert this thing, insert that thing?" So all of a sudden, you have 50 different third-party tags that you want to add onto your website, and now you're managing it directly in your code base, or maybe you're, whatever it might be. Google Tag Manager allows you to add those tags. So if I hit new here and I choose a tag, they're going to give me all these out-of-the-box tags that people are commonly adding onto their website, and the ability to write my own custom tags, right? And then what you do is you just embed the Google Tag Manager tag, and then it handles loading all the other tags the way that you want them to be loaded, right? So that's what Unqork is allowing you to do with the use case of, hey, I want to throw Google Analytics on it, doom, done. But because this is loaded and every tag within it is loaded, we can do more than just use out-of-the-box tags of Google Tag Manager. So this is how we're bringing the code in. So not only does this allow us to maintain code in a dedicated code thing and not have to put any code into Unqork, because that's codeless, but it also makes sure that that JavaScript is loaded in the head tag of the HTML and the places where you want it to be. So now let's go look at the code that's living inside of Google Tag Manager. Okay, so there's a number of things here. So the first thing you'll see are CSS overrides. Literally, why not? I actually just wanted to make my UDLC wider. So I just added a little snippet in that says, hey, if the URL starts with app UDLC, as they all do, then, just update the width tag of the container. Probably not the best way to insert this, but hey, whatever. All I wanted to do was make it 100 width and it works, right? So look at my service logs dashboard. It's really big, right? It takes up the whole screen. Yours is probably only this big, right? Okay, cool. So you can do stuff like that, fine. So now, though, there's an EXPT, which is my little shorthand for Express Extension. And then there's that, and then there's all of these other ones. So the way to think about this is the EXPT one I'm going to show, that's the SDK, right? That is the core thing that basically facilitates the interaction between code and config. And then each other one here is a specific extension. So thinking about a world where there is like a full-blown SDK, everybody downloads that, and then they go build their extension. So that these are the individual extensions, and here's the SDK. So what does the SDK do? The SDK basically makes sure that this code, and again, the code and the config are talking together. So the first thing it does, since right now, again, Unqork is Angular, and the beauty of the SDK too, and going through a manner like going through an SDK is we can take away the underlying technology. Like that's the beautiful thing about codeless, right? Is Unqork is a lot of Angular, some of React, more and more React, every single release that goes out, right? But you don't know and you don't care, right? All you care about is configuring and dragging and dropping, right? So if you're an SDK developer, you probably also don't want to be, we don't want them to be bound into specific libraries, because then a day is going to come along where we want to change the library, but now your code is tied to something else, right? So by basically providing these wrappers to the underlying framework like Angular, we're able to allow these extensions to integrate with Unqork without having to worry about the underlying technologies that are powering Unqork, right? So that's basically the first thing that happens. First thing that happens is it kind of boots itself up and it says, hey, Unqork's an Angular app, therefore let's make sure that Angular is loaded. Okay. So this is saying, is Angular loaded? Great. The moment Angular is loaded, then we want to make sure that your module is loaded. Because again, the first thing that happens is Unqork's kind of bootstraps itself. Boom, Angular is loaded at that point. Then we have to make a call to your module, get the module back, render it, and do any default initializer stuff that you want to build out this whole data, the execution data. That happens later. But both of those things need to be ready to go before your extension can do anything, right? So we basically just take care of that. Boom, now your module is ready to be extended, is effectively what this says, right? So that's what it does. It goes through and it makes sure your module is ready to go. And then it kind of like initializes itself. And what it's doing here is it's convention based. I'm a big convention over configuration, despite working in a configuration based platform, but put conventions in your config, and now you get convention on top of config, and then forget about it, right? So this is convention driven, saying here is a reserved key, effectively, exp underscore expt underscore. So you'll notice there is a property inside of this module called extp underscore query. Okay, so this is effectively a hook into our SDK. Right. So what the SDK does is it says, hey, find me every attribute, every component that you have inside the module that's being loaded that starts with EXTP, and get it ready to go. Again, create the hook between that specific piece of config and my code. Okay. So that's what it's doing. It's just basically just like a watch. Like when you choose watch in Unqork, it's waiting for the value of a component to change in order for some logic to fire. Same concept here. It waits for a value to change, and then it fires the associated extension code that you have added to it, right? So that's basically all that's going on here. And then we also added in a little utility getter setter. If you want to set data in the module or you want to extract data from the module, again, do that through a utility method, which avoids you having to go into the Angular scope and the submission data, things that could change over time, but you're abstracted from those changes, just as a whole, Unqork is always abstracting you from the underlying implementation details, right? So this method abstracts how on earth Unqork is stating its data, right? We can change this method 6 months from now. Any extensions that were built leveraging this method don't have anything to do about it, right? Similar to how your config is your config, we change the implementation, your config stays the same. You never have to change your config to make sure it keeps working, right? It just works because that's our promise to you. And that would be the promise of any SDK we build to allow you to extend it, is your extension is going to work. Okay, so now we've booted up, we've got our SDK, we've got our connection, our code and our config are talking. So then what would an extension look like? So let's open up the query extension. And this is it. It's 12 lines of JavaScript, or 11 lines, right? If I take out the script tags, I like some line breaks. You can bring this down to what? Let's actually just go in and mess with it. If I want to be a little bit less, clean with my code, what am I really looking at here? I'm looking at, honestly, what's that? 5 lines of code. So 5 lines of code, basically, to do this. So what is it doing, right? So this EXTP query is the extensions function that maps to this component. So when this component changes, this code gets executed and it's told, hey, there's a property called EXTP query. This was the new value of it, and this is the old value of it, right? So every time it changes, I'm going to get the old and the new value. So what am I doing now? Now in Unqork, where we put the query string is a little bit different, right? Unqork's query strings, as you saw in the service-like dashboard example, actually go after the hash, right? Most query strings go before the hash. Ours go after, right? Because really what Unqork does in its single-page app world, this is what it really cares about. Okay, so that's where we're going to put the query string. So we're not going to write it to the actual query string attribute of the browser. We're going to write it to the end of it where Unqork's magic in the browser all happens, right? So that's what I do. I say, hey, get me the current query string, right? And then go through and parse the object. So again, I'm storing. Now, if I go back to my front end here, and I got key value, and then I'll put in another one, which is foo bar, right? And if I go look at my console, you'll see that this is my EXTP, right? I said it was an object. So what this code does is it basically iterates over the entries in the object. It creates it adds those to this array, and then joins it by ampersands and appends it to the end of the hash, with the hash being, so what's saying here is this is saying grab the module, right? So if I go back to this example, this is taking everything before the question mark, which is the Unqork module you're on. And then it is building the query string and appending that back onto what I had here. Okay. So that's building out my query string. And then I'm writing that back to the hash. So that's why when I come in here, you'll see like nothing changes, it updates, but I'm on the same page, all that good jazz. Okay, cool. So now I can write to the query string with, again, config, only config, writing to the query string. Show another example here. I'll show an example called a chart, right? So a lot of our customers will say they may like some other chart. Like Unqork has some great charting capabilities, but doesn't have every chart under the sun. And maybe, again, another company uses a different charting library, and they want their charts to be consistent across all of their web properties. So here's an example of bringing in a different chart, called Zing chart. Okay, so I had a need for a tree. So this is what the chart data looks like. This is just, again, data, JSON object array. I hit chart, and this is what it does, right? It's a dependency graph where it says, California's in America and America's in the world, right? So this is a structure you might want in many, many different places. You might want to visualize things in this way, right? But all that really matters is that you get the data, okay? And then the chart is independent of that. So similar here, right? This is very simple. I'm saying, hey, take whatever JSON you drop in this text area, and then all I'm doing it, because then it comes through as a string because it came through a text field. So all I'm doing is I'm parsing that into an actual object, and I'm dumping it into a hidden component again that starts with EXPT, right? And that is the data for the chart. Because that's really, even if you're using Unqork's out-of-the-box charting components, what's the most important part about setting up the chart? Formatting the data for the chart in the way the chart needs the data, right? So that's all we're doing here is we're taking any data you want in the world and we're formatting it in the way that we want, which is, hey, we need an ID, we need a name, which is what you see here. ID is some unique identifier for this node. A value, in this case, it's population, right? But a value controls the size. Like these are just, details of the chart. And then if you want to define something as a parent, you say parent, and then you use the ID of it, right? So you can do this throughout. And in fact, if I go into, I'll show this little like private, I got to find a good example. I'll show this little private UDLC extension that I built, which was like a tracing thing, right? Where I can actually trace how things work inside of a given module. Now, of course, again, I can't find all these logs or I should have grabbed a log ahead of time and planned to actually show this though. This one doesn't work. I've got a better way to do this. All right, cool. So we're just going to jump back over here. We're going to view. We're going to grab a service log ID over here. Okay, cool. So now what you see at the bottom is you're going to see a dependency map of how the components of this, when this module is executed, this is the order of operations that it took. There was a setup operation, which triggered an initializer, which triggered a plugin, which triggered a data workflow, which output a value, right? Actually, how your components worked. This is using the debug data that you get from the server-side execute debugger, where you know how you can step through. We just visualize that differently, right? So we just took, if we go into our console here, right, all that was done was we took the log, we took its event log. This is the data that says, you know, the cause key setup, right? The cause key setup, the component was initializer, and the event type was set data, right? So that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing this represented in such a way that I was able to say that the init's parent is setup. So if I go down here and I look at the value of the XTP Zing chart tree, what does it have? ID, name, parent, value. ID, name, parent, value. The exact structure that Zing chart expects, but I massaged this event data that comes from a platform API. I just use the data workflow to convert it into the format that Zing chart wants. I drop it into my extension framework, and now I have it working, right? On data that came from somewhere else in Unqork. So just to quickly show that. And then again, that is actually now in this extension, I'm bringing in external JavaScript. I want to load in Zing chart's JavaScript. I'm going to do this thing that they tell me to do. Then I'm going to write my method. Okay. And then this is what it does. It has the code of Zing chart. And then I'm passing in dynamically the value that I got from the component, that hidden component on the page. And then I'm doing one other sneaky thing where I said, okay, well, if I go back to this config, there's a hidden field and then there's an HTML element. The HTML element is where I want to draw the chart. So I'm just telling Zing chart, take it from this component and output it into a component with the same name, but with HTML inside of it, right? And then I've got a little CSS in there as well. Sorry, Zing chart, hid your license. All right, so now I've added a new chart, but all I need to do again from config is I don't know that there's a new chart here, so to speak. Obviously, that's one of the things that would come in a later level of the BYOC is, in this case, I just kind of like drag in a hidden component and I know what's up. In another world, you would that extension would be its own component, right? But in the meantime, it could be a snippet, right? I could easily make, and I might even have that Zing chart tree, right? So I have a snippet, I drag that in, and voila, I got it, right? So I've got so a snippet is effectively my component. Okay. So now I've loaded in an external charting library to chart things in a different way. All right. The last example I want to show in the front end stuff are web components. So web components, this goes more to the examples of customers maybe having built their own thing. So what a web component is basically a new way to share UI logic, right? And UI elements, where you can define, and I'll show you, this is going to have a little content component. You can define custom HTML tags. So then if a user wants to include your UI, like you might have built, you'll see some examples here. All they do is they just drop in this new HTML tag, and then your code hooks in and everybody's happy. Okay. So I have two examples of web components that I think I pulled right off of, I would say Microsoft, Mozilla Developer Network. You must love MDN. They have a whole thing on web components. I grabbed a couple of their examples, right? And I embedded them into Unqork. Now, there are content components because you have to put the HTML in, and our HTML element is secure in that it won't allow you to put in dangerous or non-standard tags. So if I try to put in hello world as my tag name inside of my HTML component, like I would have to go like this, it's not going to work because we would block that tag, because as it says here, or as it says, unsaved HTML tags and attributes will not be saved. Since Unqork has no idea what a hello world tag is, we're not going to let you embed it directly in HTML tag. Fine. That'll be fixed in a later time, but not really fixed, it's not broken. In the meantime, let me just drop it into my content component. So again, I have a similar setup, right? I have some config with EXPT, some config with EXPT, and then I have my web component HTML. And when I preview this, let's see what happens. Okay, so I've got two things now. I've got this thing that says hello Nick, and I've got this whole editable list. This is not a UI that Unqork has. This format of a list. You can build a list in Unqork. There's a million ways you can build a list in Unqork. We don't have this way of building a list in Unqork, and maybe you want this way to build a list in Unqork because every other list in your organization is built this way. So you want to build it this way in Unqork. Okay, so let's show you two different ways. So the first thing I want to say is, so now again we have code that completely lives elsewhere. Now, in the Google Tag Manager thing here, you'll look that I don't have any specific down here. I don't have any specific hello world, nor do I have any specific editable list. But what I did was I brought in their code, right? So this is an example of what a web component's code looks like, right? Hello world extends the default HTML element class of the browser to define your own HTML element, which is called, hello world, right? And then it just has something that says, if you change the attribute of name, basically it's just going to render hello name, where name is the attribute name of the HTML element. Okay. So when I go back over here, you'll look, I said name is Nick. Therefore, on my front end, it says hello Nick. Now I can come here and I can write Dana or Danya. To my favorite people here, right? I can write that and it's automatically updating. And Natalie too, right? So I can update that. Okay. So how am I doing that, right? And how is my config talking to my web component? Okay. Now on the flip side, and it's the same concept, right? I have a name, I'm outputting it into a hidden variable. And this one's a little different, where this is saying, again, convention-based, EXTP web component says, trigger my web component extension. And this property is, this is where you set the attribute of the one instance where the ID is 1, and I want to set the name. I probably should have changed those, or maybe I can change those orders. It's like web component attribute, the version of the web component. So I can have 2 here, right? I can have, ID 2, and then I can have another one here called, attribute 2 name, and now I can talk to 2 different web components, right? Based on their IDs, because IDs are unique in your HTML. If your IDs are not unique in your HTML, it's bad HTML. Right? So now I'm able to, and then what happens is when this value changes, my code goes ahead and says, cool, change if it's an attribute, which is what was the first underscore here, then just update the attribute of that object. Cool. So now I'm sending data into my web component by leveraging the attributes. There are other ways to send data to web components. We can support those, but for now, we're going to support attributes. All right. Now, on the other side of it, here is an editable list where all of the interactions happen within. So everything here, all of this is not Unqork. This is the web component. So including this text field. So Unqork doesn't really know what's going on in this text field. So how is Unqork going to get information about what's going on in this web component and do something with it? So if I, for example, here hit test and I hit plus, what should happen is I'm going to get a little modal pop up that says you added test, and now I'm going to dump out these records into an Unqork component. This is a dynamic grid. All right, so I got data and actions that happened in here can now trigger pop messages and component rendering inside of Unqork. Very similar concept, but this is event driven. So this is kind of fun thing. I know a lot of people have asked, like, do you get browser events in Unqork? Maybe you can do this. So in a web component event, so here I had web component attribute up here, and I have web component event down here. And then I have the event defined, right? Because inside of the editable list code, it says when an element is added, okay, it's going to fire off an event. It's going to dispatch an event called editable list add, and then it's going to give me details about that. So every time, so the web component says, hey, when someone's doing something inside my component that you don't know anything about, I'm going to fire this event off. If you care about this event, listen to it, right? Listen to this event. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm saying by naming this component, web component event editable list add, I'm effectively saying I want to listen to this event. Okay, so that's where the code comes in again, where it has an initializer code which says, hey, do any of your properties start with EXTP web component event? If it does, then I want you to add an event listener for that event by replacing everything in it except for the event name. So if I replace extb web component underscore event in here, I get left with editable list event. So it's just saying, hey, you told me you want to listen to the editable list event. So now I'm going to subscribe to it. And when that event gets fired, I'm going to push the data of the event into that component, right? So if I now go back into my Express over here and I actually look inside editable list event, I'm getting my event details. These are the details that came from my web component, right? It wrote everything that I need in config to then do what I need to do, right? And then in config, all I do is then I watch for that field and then I set my pop message, right? If it equals something. Okay, so now Unqork config again, responding to browser events or events that happen on behalf of a web component. So now you can embed web components in Unqork and interact with them, again, completely codelessly. Okay, so that's front end extending of Express. Back end extending of Express will hopefully be a little bit quicker on this one. Let's talk about Lambda. Okay, so Lambda, for folks who don't know, this is really serverless. Like a lot of times when folks talk about serverless, they just talk about cloud. They're getting lumped together a lot right now, but serverless is basically what this is, right? So here's some code. Okay, this is code that just lives as its own dedicated Lambda function. Okay, which means whenever somebody wants, they can just run this code and AWS takes care of the rest of it. In order for me to build this function and make it work, all I did was paste code into this UI and hit deploy. Do I know where it deployed to? Do I know if it got deployed to a Linux or a Windows server, an Ubuntu or a CentOS or a Red Hat server? I don't know. I do not care. And I don't care how big that server is, how small that server is, the networking of that server doesn't matter. All I know is my code's going to get run. And if one person executes my code, AWS has me covered. If a million people execute my code, AWS has me covered, right? That's the beauty of serverless. There is no, you don't manage the server, you just manage the code, right? Just like Unqork doesn't even have make care. Unqork, with the exception of extending, doesn't have you worry about the code. It just has you worry about the logic, right? It's all about abstraction. So here's some code, okay? Now, what does this code do? So what this code actually does is this code actually parses an open API specification, like Unqork's developers at Unqork.io, right? So there is, if I open this in a new tab, right? Oh, it didn't do it. This is open. This is Unqork's open API spec, right? It's our documentation. This page, which probably looks similar to a lot of other API documentation pages you've ever looked at, is based on the open API specification. So our engineers are documenting our APIs with the open API specification. You might be more familiar with the Unqork API specification, was completely inspired by the open API spec, right? So all that is JSON, okay? But that JSON can get very, very nested, right? There's this idea of references where you can basically reuse definitions of your spec. So let's say, for example, you have a create user, right? And then this is all the details you need about a user. There's a very good chance that inside of our spec, instead of this being, a key value pair for each attribute, it says, oh, the request body, that's actually a user. And then it points to the user. And then inside the user definition is all of the user stuff, right? So that could be hard to traverse. It could be hard to figure out, well, what are all the attributes of a user if I have to say, well, this is telling me it's a reference to the user spec, and then I go to the user spec, but then maybe the user spec has a reference to the groups spec, which then defines what a group's input looks like, and so on and so on and so on. So I said, I can data workflow that. We've data workflowed that a million times before, but I didn't want to data workflow that. It's recursion, this is recursion here. Very fun programming problem. Not really a problem, but it's always like that litmus test in an interview. Like, can you prove that you learned recursion in CS 101? But basically, it's a function that calls itself, right? And it'll continue to call itself until it's all done. So basically, every time as you're traversing through this JSON object, you find a property called ref. Then you need to go and do the same thing and go find out all of its refs, right? And you go and you go and you go and you go and you go, and voila! In the end, we're going to send back the user a list of a service and a list of modules, which is parsed from an open API spec, any open API spec in the world. Now, this structure is something that can be easily handled inside of Unqork. All right. Again, it's something I could have configured, but I chose to code it because I felt that it was, one, going to be a good use case for extensions, but two, I honestly personally felt that it might be a little bit nicer in code. But a lot of people would look at this and be like, you're an idiot, Nick. Why didn't you do to workflow it? So much clearer. Teach their own. Okay. So now I've got this code, which takes in an open API spec and shoots me back a parsed version of it, right? How do I leverage this code inside of Unqork? So we kind of showed this a couple weeks ago. We were doing AWS on this show. But all we do is we execute this Lambda function as an API. So if I come into my import framework and I go to the Open API transformation, okay, so this is that framework where we showed you importing Salesforce and ServiceNow and all these other things. Open API is just another flavor of an import. So what this is actually going to do is it's going to parse that Open API spec, and it's going to create you a service in your service administration, and it's going to create you a snippet for a plugin for each and every endpoint in this spec. So just an example of that, I come down here, I drag in plug generate refer string, which is the first users. Oh, where is it? It was somewhere here. Generate. Let's look for refer. Gets encrypted refer string, right? So this is one of the methods inside of our API spec. Generate an encrypted refer string for authentication. Okay. And it takes in user ID, expire, offset, expire, measure, right? This is all documented in the JSON schema, in the JSON spec, right? Here's my request body. This is my endpoint / refer string is my endpoint. And obviously I'm talking Unqork. So now if I go back and I look at this plugin, what does it have? Well, it's pointing to my Unqork customer API spec. It's hitting the endpoint refer string, and all of my attributes are already mapped for me, including the fact that user ID is required, right? So an automatically generated plugin based off of an industry standard API specification, okay? So that's what the module is doing. But in order to get to this point, again, we got to parse through that very nested open API spec. So the first thing we do is we take the spec, and all we do is we invoke the Lambda function. Open API parse, right? And then it gives me back services and modules, which, as I showed you in the code, that's the return. The return value is an object that has a services and a modules key. So then I just map out from the response. I map those out. They're just two arrays or objects, depending on which one it is. And then I just continue with my config. So once again, zero code, but now I can recursively traverse an open API spec just by using a plugin, whether it was an API that already existed out there in the world or a specific endpoint, a specific function that somebody wanted to build and deploy with no worry, right? So now my backend stuff is extended with Unqork with code, but in a codeless manner. So my config is all still config. All right, well, here we go. That's it. I'm done talking about extensions. Now I probably got to go get some hair extensions or just let it grow for a little bit. But yeah, like I said, those are some examples of things you could do today. But definitely over the next year, you're going to see this really materialize, I think, in a number of other ways. But in the meantime, you know, if you ever do hit a wall on Unqork, and I know that you probably do, despite the fact that, you know, we've broken down a lot of walls. If you hit a wall and you're curious about ways that you can get around that wall or bust through that wall or hop over that wall, or however you want to go around the wall or get through the wall, get to the other side, this could be one option for you. So hope this was interesting. And, you know, everyone's pretty cool with talking a little code on a codeless channel with the Uncoder. So thank you, and I'll catch you all next time.